They told her to disappear. The Marigold's lobby gleamed like a polished tooth. Marble swallowed shoes, chandeliers spilled slow gold, and the staff moved through it all like practiced ghosts. Guests drifted in and out in a shimmer of silk and perfume, but for the day the hotel's veins pulsed with something else. The Malhotra name. Security earpieces hummed, spray bottle custodians fell into strict patterns, and the operations manager repeated the same order, over and over, until the words were part of the tiles. "Do not draw attention," Mr. Kapoor said, voice sanded smooth by years of diffusing tension. "No greetings, no questions. Eyes down, you are furniture." Vanessa Jenkins folded that order into her uniform, the way she folded sheets. Clean, so that no crease betrayed the hand that had made it. The white gloves hugged her fingers like a second skin. The hotel apron cinched at the waist. She had learned to become background the way some people learn to speak, through repetition, modulation, and 100 small trades of survival. She had learned other things too, how to read the space a person took in a room, which seat was always avoided, how a corridor told you where someone would try to vanish, how a lullaby hummed at the edge of memory could pull a man upright from 100 years of habit. On paper she was Vanessa J. Room Service. In other people's eyes she was an efficient shadow. They never saw the arsenal beneath. The map stitched behind a wardrobe panel in a rented apartment, the burner phones hidden under a false floorboard, the languages threaded like locks to different doors. They did not see the child who had answered to another name and another life before she became invisible in the lacquered world of the Marigold. The Malhotra convoy arrived at noon. Black sedans cut through Mumbai traffic like knives. Men in crisp kurtas and private suits spilled out, umbrellas folded like hidden blades. Cameras snapped from across the street. Not the press, just affiliates. Men with phone cameras who sent images and whispers away like spores. Inside, a security perimeter hummed with static. The concierge hung a small, unobtrusive sign. Private reception. Vanessa kept to her station near the service lift, adjusting cutlery, refolding napkins into the same precise cones she had lined up for years. Her movements were slow and economical, the kind of economy that let a person do 6 things while looking like one. She watched the marble at her feet and the people who passed by it. The swagger of junior lieutenants, the practiced calm of the patriarch's personal aide, the young men who thought posture was a kind of armor. He arrived, not like a headline, but like old weather. Unannounced gusts in the middle of clear air. They called him Dadaji here, Devender Malhotra, a man with the kind of reputation that flattened rooms. At 90, he wore his power like a cloak. Hands that had once smoothed young men's ambitions now folded over a cane. Every tilt of his jaw counted more than a speech. No microphones for him. You felt his presence in the sudden silence that took over a room, as if the chandeliers themselves were listening. Vanessa's face, turned away as if checking a menu, caught the angle of his entrance. For a fraction of a second she considered following orders exactly. Do not look, do not speak, do not give any reason to be noticed. Then the elevator stalled. It was a small thing, a technician's hiccup, a lodged gasket, but it changed the choreography. The service lift shuddered and paused between floors. A strip of light winked out. Someone cursed softly. The staff clustered like suppressed weather around mechanical metal. The main lift doors opened across the hall, disgorging men who had been waiting. Somewhere, a child's laugh from the banquet floor dissolved into the hum of air conditioning. Vanessa stepped forward to check on an errant tray. The paused lift door yawned, and through that gap a man stepped in, his shoulders hunched against the world. He was smaller than his reputation suggested, but his eyes were as bright as a blade, old steel tempered by decades of decisions. For a moment, no one moved. There was a tilt in the air, like the light toward evening. She said the first word that came into her mouth. Not English, not the clipped courtesy of a hotel script, but a rough, familiar sound that anchored her to another life, a greeting learned as a child, a sound still soft as smoke on the tongue. Pranam Dadaji. The lobby inhaled and then froze. The phrase landed not as a performance, but as a fissure in concrete. It fit the old man's memory like a hand into a pocket. He froze as if struck. The men around him tightened. On his face something shifted, an almost childish softness, the way years can roll back when you find a sound that matches your bones. For staff and guests it was a small, dissonant moment. For Devender Malhotra, it was a hook into a past he had kept under lock and blood. Arjun Malhotra, his son, the heir apparent, and the public face of the Malhotra network, stepped forward with a polite smile, designed to hide suspicion. Arjun was a man built on momentum, a reputation of hunger wrapped in expensive suits. He leaned in, lips close to the old man's ear, testing. "Did you say something?" he asked, the sentence soft as silk but sharp beneath. Vanessa's hand tightened around a tray. Her heart, trained to a meter that counted breaths in dangerous rooms, kicked up. She could have receded. She'd done it 1,000 times. But the sound had come free of her calculation. The greeting had come out of muscle memory, the lull of a dialect her foster father had spoken around a kerosene lamp, the way vowels bled into one another when a man tried to keep something to himself. Devender's eyes slid from the tray to Vanessa, and then fixed, the way a person fixes on an old photograph. The memory came to him not in words, but in a particular cadence, the slow, rounded vowels of Bhojpuri, the rural music of a village market, and a man he once knew who had a laugh like a broken string. His mouth shaped an old name that hadn't left him for years. "Kaun?" he asked, which in the fog of an old tongue might mean simply, "Who?" But in the syllable he carried the weight of a lifetime of alliances. Vanessa had an answer she had not planned for. Names were traps. Names could be used like maps to find bodies hidden in shallow graves. But some names have a stickiness that finds the throat nonetheless. A ghost name lifted out of her, one she had only used in the dark and when she whispered it at night into a pillow. Babu ke bachi. The old man's eyes widened then, and he shifted his cane as if remembering the direction a wound had been made. Arjun's smile hardened. Power fights over the smallest of beginnings. A syllable, a gesture, a hesitation. The heir's jaw tightened. "She speaks like him," someone muttered, only loud enough to be caught by the people with the right ears. A senior aide moved through the crowd like a broom, rearranging conversations to make sense of the fracture. Security watched Vanessa with a curiosity that felt sharp rather than amused. To them she was still furniture, but there was now a smudge on the lacquer. Vanessa could feel time abrade her edges. Old reflexes split her into neat compartments. The maid, the child of a lieutenant, the operative who had spent a decade collecting small threads of evidence. She did not look at the old man when she answered. She placed the tray on a cart and backed away, the smallest bow a practiced sign of deference. "Just a guess, sir," she said in English. Her voice kept the hotel's cadence, measured and invisible. In the spaces between, her Bhojpuri hummed like a hidden radio. Arjun's interest deepened into something surgical. He signaled Mr. Kapoor, who came over with a smile that tried to be balm and threat at once. "She is new on shifts today," Kapoor said. "Training staff from the outside, probably nervous." "Get her to serve the private table," Arjun said casually, like a man assigning a servant. It was a command wrapped in civility. For Vanessa, it was an ignition. The private suite, further stair A, a narrow gilded passage reserved for the family, was colder than the public lobby. There were smaller lights there, the kind that ate faces in a way that showed too much. The table where the old man sat had a low hum of men who were all eyes and teeth. Vanessa moved through the corridor with the kind of quiet that announces itself only when it chooses to. Up close, Devinder Malhotra was all paradox. His hands bore the tremor of age, but they were not idle, ornaments of power that had once signed things nobody had wanted to read. A scent of attar and older tobacco clung to his coat. It sat at the edge of his collar like a name he could not fully remember. She set the plates with the precision of a ritual. She did not meet his gaze. She did not speak more Bhojpuri. But he watched her hands, the small habitual ways she folded a napkin, and the scar at her wrist where a bracelet had once been in her childhood. As if trying to touch a memory, he asked, "Where are you from, child?" The word "child" carried a history in his voice, a softness, a recall. Vanessa's mind flicked with the smell triggers they'd taught her to use when she was young. The burning of mustard oil at twilight, the rattle of handcarts in a village, the sound of someone humming that old lullaby while tightening a bandage. Her reply was guarded, but true. "Bihar," she said. Silence spread. Bihar, river plains, dust, markets, was not where the men of Mumbai were born. It was where people like her had been plucked from and then expected to vanish. The dialect had spoken of a place Devender had once known through a lieutenant who had come to him with loyalty and wounds. The being of another man in a far place had been part of his power's trade. He still kept those memories like items in a small secret room. Recognition moved in his eyes like a tide. A series of small tests unfurled. Arjun, with a soldier's patience, tried routine enticements. A joke, the mention of certain villages, a friendly jest about the city's food. Vanessa replied with the practiced neutrality of service. She had lived in rooms where identity could be a life sentence, where any slip could trade a life for a rumor, so she guarded the edges of herself like a treasure. But there is always something that cannot be fully given up. In an industry of forgetting, a human being accumulates the shape of old sounds. When a man from your past is standing in a lighted room and you feel the weight of a name settle in your chest, certain movements are almost inevitable. The slip came not in vocabulary but in rhythm, a certain elongated vowel, the softening of a consonant, the way a question ended without the crispness of English. Devender caught it and leaned forward. "You know Babu?" he asked, the syllables breaking like pottery. The name tasted like ash to Vanessa's mouth. At that name, Babu, a chapter of crooked sunlight slid into place. Babu had been more than a lieutenant. He had been a father in the only way that had mattered. He had found her on the steps of a marketplace crumbling with the weight of neglect, taken a knife to a throat that had been about to be cut, and taught her the value of silence and of memory. He had shown her how to fold a life into the small shapes people ignored. Then he had been broken, gone in a way that left the world looking like an injustice painted red. The memory arrived like heat. Vanessa felt her breath hitch. Around the table the air gathered into a pressure, like a storm about to cross. Arjun's eyes narrowed. "You know names?" he asked, testing. She kept her voice low. "I knew him," she said. He saved me. He taught me." Arjun softened with the practiced empathy of a man who had used charm as a weapon. "And you remember his name clearly?" "Yes," she said. It was true in the way that mattered. Some names live like iron in the body. He looked toward Devender, and in that glance there was conversation, maps being redrawn in the brain of a man who spent his life tracing lines between people. Devender's fingers tightened around the cane until the knuckles went white. The exchange might have ended like any other awkward, sentimental intervention, except for a sound that cut the air, a pop, muffled and wrong. It was the kind of sound no one wanted to hear in a room full of business and reputation. A second later, another sound, a bullet's distance, softened by the insensitive architecture, made the fine vase on the side table quiver. Vanessa's body answered before her mind agreed to the action. It was not heroism, it was habit. Someone in a kitchen once slammed a pan, and she had leaned away from the steam. Later, a man had hauled a bolt, and she had learned how to slide without hitting the floor. Instinct stitched itself into movement. Her feet found the service corridor's old muscles. Routes in and out, blind corners, supply doors that opened into chaos. The initial shot had not missed by much. Broken porcelain scattered like rain. A hidden panel dislodged. Panic did not erupt. Protocols built a wall around it. The patriarchy's men reached for guns with slick, practiced motions. The Malhotra household security tightened like a fist closing. Vanessa did not think about what she could do. She moved. She pushed a cart in front of herself, not so much as defense as using the promise of service to carry bodies out of line of fire. Her hands were steady as she used aprons and trays like shrouds, maneuvering a route she'd run 100 times in her head. Men fell like dominoes of surprise, not all of them hit by bullets but stopped by disbelief. A maid acting with a speed they had not programmed. A second report, closer, severe, made people duck. Glass shattered like a chorus. The private suite dissolved into the half-light of survival, men shouting orders that were met with a disciplined response. Arjun barked commands, but the heir's voice sounded strained, fear under the armor. Devinder's cane had rolled away. Someone scrambled for it like a boy chasing a falling star. Vanessa directed bodies with gestures that belonged in another kind of war. She moved Devender toward a hidden service stair used by staff to bring linens. The stairwell smelled of bleach and oil, and in that narrow womb she felt the world become honest. The old man leaned on her as if she were a remembered thing. For a moment she felt his life hang like a coin on a string. "Who fired?" Arjun demanded as they reached the stairwell. His voice cut into the thin oxygen of fear. A lieutenant in a pressed kurta, his shirt already dark at one shoulder, stood in the doorway. "Someone from the east corridor," he said, throat tight. Suppressed shot, like a professional. Vanessa's training made certain muscle responses automatic. She counted exits the way some people count money. Even as the hotel security scrambled to corral the assault, her mind ran through fraught possibilities that would have made a different plan necessary. The shot had been targeted, but at whom? A gambler's bullet rarely hit the mark the first time. In the madness of the hallway she saw faces, men with small flat expressions who handled phones like talismans, a waiter who lingered too long near the service lift, a janitor's cap that had not been there yesterday. They moved down the stairwell in a single folded line, defenders and defended. Outside, the pouched men of the Malhotra family sealed the doors. The hotel's polished lobby became a cage of lights and cameras outside their bubble. When they reached a small service corridor, Vanessa stepped aside, giving the old man room. She wanted to be invisible again, but the old man's hand closed unexpectedly on her wrist. "You speak like him," he said, so softly she had to tilt her head to hear it. Her mouth tasted of iron. The stairwell smelled of bleach and her foster father's stories, of a river that stank in summer and of teeth chipped at dawn. She felt a thread slacken inside her. "He taught me how to stay alive," she said. In the smallness of that space, something shifted in Devender's expression that had nothing to do with power. It was an ache, the kind that promises both a wound and its antidote. He looked at her as if seeing a younger mirror, as if memory had come to the room not as a ghost, but as a person who had been practicing for the right moment. "Why were you here in service?" he asked. The question was simple, the history behind it was not. "Because he wanted me to be invisible," she said. "To listen." "Listen to what?" Arjun demanded. The heir's anger had a dry, mechanical edge. He did not like being surprised. He felt perhaps that control was slipping through his buttered fingers. "To remember," Vanessa said. There was no triumph in the answer, only the taut tautology of survival. "To track things people don't expect a maid to track." Arjun's scowl deepened. "You work here," he said flatly. "You have no business," Vanessa interrupted, not out of bravado but out of economy. "You think I have the luxury of having no business?" she asked. Her voice had the thin, fine steel of someone who had been honed. "I have business that doesn't have the luxury of being loud. What happened today wasn't random." Arjun stepped back, as if she had touched him. He weighed her with the cold arithmetic of someone who built empires out of human capital. Devender looked at his son, then at Vanessa. The old man's hand shook around the cane once and then steadied. "Find out who did it," Devender said, his voice no longer the brittle thing the press had written about, but a quiet command from a man used to decisions. "Do not let this settle like silt. We will have answers." The way he said it made everyone in the corridor rethink the geometry of the day. Commands from him were not mere orders. They were ripples in an ocean that had swallowed men whole. Arjun's jaw clenched as if the old man had reset something inside the family ledger. Vanessa felt the room narrow to the width of a file drawer. There had been days when she had pretended not to hear the names that meant everything. She had practiced folding her past into something small enough to hide under a pillow. But the shot had broken that pattern open like a jar. She also knew how this would be read by men like Arjun. A maid with connections to a past lieutenant was a threat to a house that had built itself on secrecy. For her, the question was whether she would be used as an asset, a scapegoat, or something else entirely. For men like Arjun, she was a variable in a ledger of power they did not like to calculate. "Stay in the service wing," Arjun said, trying on control like a groom choosing a suit. "We will place a guardian." "Not here," Devender interrupted, surprising them both. He looked at Vanessa with an intensity that had nothing to do with his failing body. "She will come with me. If there is someone putting bullets into rooms, I want my family safe. And I think—" He paused, slow as a man who had kept something buried. "I know something she knows." Vanessa felt a strange, sudden dislocation. He wasn't offering the old transactional kindness of a man who collects people like currency. He was offering clarity, the unromantic kind. A path forward. No promise of reward, no golden gratitude. Just the bare fact of being seen. They moved again, down corridors used by staff to exit into alleys that smelled of rickshaw oil and frying spices. The city's soundtrack rose up, an ancient, messy hum of horns and hawkers, like a living thing. Vanessa's chest was tight. She had built her life with the expectation of solitude and the habit of making her pockets into safes. Having someone like Devender see her was a risk she had not wanted, but had quietly hoped for, because sometimes a person needed to be recognized to be vindicated. At the temporary safe room in the hotel, a curtained, cordoned-off suite meant for high-risk guests, Devender sat with his cane between his knees and asked questions he had never asked before. He wanted to know where she was from, who taught her to speak that cadence, why a woman like her would care about the company's netting of shipments, and the patterns of who came and went in back rooms. His curiosity was not prying. It was surgical. She gave him answers in degrees. The small, useful ones that satisfied immediate suspicion, and the quieter ones that carried edges. She spoke of a village market on the edge of a river, of nights where roofs leaked and people bartered memories for rice. She spoke of an older man who had taken her in, who had taught her the names of things and how to move through a room without leaving the shape of yourself behind. His finger tapped the cane once, twice, and the old man nodded as if a world had pieced itself together. "Ravi Chauhan," he said finally, as if the name had been a puzzle solved. Vanessa's chest tightened. A sound like wind came out of the hallway. She began, but Devender had already closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in a man letting the weight of grief settle. "Ravi," he murmured. He was a good man. In that small, bright room, with the city's noise like a faraway river, Vanessa felt the old architecture of her life shift. The attack at the hotel had not been a random strike. It had been a message. She had spent years building a map inside a rented apartment, ledgers and micro-contacts hidden behind false drawers, a network of those who owed her nothing but information. The hotel had been a baited hook that now turned its belly up. She had choices. Stop. Fade back to the neat invisibility she'd been trained in, and let those men decide what to do with the broken glass and the frightened old man, or stand up and make those choices herself. Devender looked at her as if he knew which option would fit her like a new coat. "You can tell me everything you know," he said, voice soft as a blessing. "Or you can leave it in the dark. But if you help us, you'll be protected." It was not a promise. Promises had a pattern. This was a requisition of trust. Protection in Devender Malhotra's world had its own syntax, a kind of currency that paid in territory and breathing room instead of cash. Vanessa weighed the offer as she had weighed a blade against her palm. The only question was whether it cut in a way she wanted. She had spent the decade since Ravi's death building her dossier, a slow needlework task. Evidence was not dramatic. Ledgers, bank names folded like prayer, a list of warehouses where certain shipments had been routed through shell companies. She had footage, or rather fragments stitched from favors and small cameras. She had voices recorded in the cadence of negotiators. She had, most importantly, the memory of a village lullaby that, when sung in a certain way, made some of the old men stop and swear at their own ages. She also had vengeance. The word sat at the back of her throat like a seed. It was a private hunger, one that had consumed nights and paid for training and kept the ledger of names sharp. The Malhotra heir's presence complicated that. The family she was considering allying with had, through time, been both a shelter and a potential threat to the truth she wanted to expose. Devender's hand found hers, light, old, and she saw in his eyes not the calculation of a syndicate boss, but the raw material of a man who had lost someone he loved and needed to know why. That need opened doors that might otherwise have remained stubbornly shut. "Show me," he said simply. They left the suite not as employer and maid, but as something less definable. A brief partnership stitched by shared memory. Arjun watched them go with the kind of impatience that thought only of power and the fall of its petals. He would decide soon whether she was a threat to be erased or an asset that could be turned into profit. For now, the old man had asked, and for reasons that would become a different kind of politics, the heir stayed his hand. Vanessa's apartment was on the 7th floor of a building the city had forgotten. The lift there still smelled faintly of incense. The stairwell held the ghost of other people's smells. She locked the door with an old tumbler key that rumbled against metal, the way a wake rattles glass. Inside it was a small, efficient chaos. Walls lined with maps, corners stacked with backup phones, a false-bottom chest with paper bundles tied in twine. The place was quiet as a pocket. She moved as if conducting an orchestra into a rhythm she had played for years. Drawers popped open to reveal ledgers that listed names alongside sums, columns of code words and warehouses, printed emails folded like artifacts. On the wall was a faded photograph, a man with a gap-toothed grin and an arm around a little girl who did not yet know how to keep herself whole. Vanessa took off her apron and hung it with the kind of care that treated cloth as memory. The hand tremor in her wrist was not fear, but the aftershock of telling a story aloud after years of silence. "Where did you get all this?" Devender asked, standing like a man who had been used to other people's resources suddenly finding himself in someone else's private museum. Bits, she said simply. Favors. People you never notice. A man who kept the right ledgers for me to find. The kind of things cleaners see when they touch a desk that people think is closed. She slid a folder across the table and opened it. A ledger lay there, numbers inked in a fading hand, company names that, if traced, moved like rabbits into burrows that led to banks and warehouses. There were photos from a dock, not graphic but precise, an unloaded container, a coded manifest. She pointed to a name that was circled in pencil. Rana Logistics. Devender's old fingers tapped the paper. Rana, he said. The name had the sound of a man who had made himself into a kingdom. Rana Shekhar, he murmured. We thought we had him in the north, years ago. Vanessa's face closed around a quiet resolve. He moved inside you, she said. Not outside. He threaded people inside your books. It's how he hides the tracks. He buried people, Dadaji. He made them less than people by making them invisible in spreadsheets. The old man's eyes darkened. He looked at the ledger, as if it contained the bodies of men he had once thought to be innocents. For Devender, the realization landed like a blow, and a relief at once. If Rana had indeed found purchase inside the Malhotra firm, the rot was not just external, it was a betrayal from within. He set the ledger down like a confession. We will find him, he said. Vanessa watched him, measuring whether his words were the kind of thing that translated as action. He had the weight and slowness of a man whose decisions rippled outward with consequence, but she had seen gentleness turned into a thing men used to resist accusations, and rage turned into deals. She would need more than good intentions. She closed the folder. I didn't build this to kill a man, she said. I built it so he could be taken apart, for the people he bought and sold, for the women who are not names, and for the men who disappeared. I don't want revenge as much as I want closure. True closure, not a body buried under another title. Devender looked at her as if trying to reconcile the image of the woman who would bring him justice with the faded images on his wall of men who had been his brothers. You will have it, he said simply. Help me make sure he cannot buy his way back into the life of anyone else. Outside, the city continued. A truck honked. Someone argued over the price of vegetables. A boy called for chai. Inside the apartment, stacks of paper breathed a dry, papery sigh. Vanessa felt the familiar lead weight of a plan settling into her bones, the way a captain might feel a map align with a coastline. There was a knock at the door before they could fully begin to sort the maps. Vanessa moved faster than would seem possible for a woman who had been a maid all morning. Her hand hit the latch, her fingers searching for a drawer, and her mind already placing the knock in a pattern, the steady 3 taps of someone deliberate, not casual. When she opened the door, she found not a man with ill intent, but a young courier, face damp from the afternoon rain, holding a small envelope. He handed it over with the deferential posture of someone who carries other people's secrets for a living, then left without looking back. Vanessa slid it open with a knife from the counter. Inside was a single photograph, the edges curled and the image worn. A warehouse at night, lights slanted like watching eyes, a truck with the same logo as the ledger's notation, and a note, scrawled in a hand that trembled as if written in a hurry. He knows he was noticed. Be careful. S. Vanessa's gaze lifted to Devender, then back to the photograph. The apartment felt too small suddenly, a room with walls that might not hold secrets long. Who is S? Devender asked. She did not answer right away. Her mind had started an engine and it wouldn't idle. The safe, quiet plan she had kept for so long had been cracked open by one greeting in an elevator. The old man had seen her. The heir had watched. The ledger was a map that might bring down Rana Shekhar, or it might trigger the very danger she had spent years trying to avoid. Someone who owes me, she said finally, and someone who wants something they can't name without me. Devender nodded slowly. He folded his hands on his cane and looked very, very old in the way a man does when everything solid in his world has suddenly softened. Outside, Mumbai lived indifferent and loud. Inside, Vanessa's apartment hummed with files and old lullabies. She took a breath that tasted of iron and determination. She had aligned herself with a man whose family carried power like a disease, but power could also be a scalpel when wielded properly. This was not about switching allegiances for profit. It was about opening doors that had been locked for too long. She spread the ledger on the table, placed the photograph down as if offering a toast to a ghost. Her fingers traced. Her fingers traced the circled name as if it might lift from the paper and speak. The ledger smelled faintly of dust and the sea breeze that carried itself through the windows of the 7th-floor building. Outside, the city exhaled in its usual ragged way. Inside, the folds of paper were a map to a man who had learned to bury bodies inside corporate forms. Devender watched her, his chair sinking a little with age. "We cannot do this alone," he said. "Rana has friends in places where the sun will not show his face." Vanessa looked up at him. She had expected that answer. All her life she had worked in the spaces that others ignored precisely to avoid dependence, but the ledger on her table and the photograph in her palm had shifted something larger than her appetite for private revenge. If Rana's network had roots inside the Malhotra firm, then uprooting it required fire from more than one side. She unfolded another sheet, a carbon copy of a shipping manifest, the words stamped in a bureaucrat's indifference. "Rana launders through logistics companies," she said. "He has used shell firms to make people vanish on paper. Banks, warehouses, transport. Not all of it appears criminal unless you follow the same thread through 10 different hands." Devender tapped the cane twice. "There are honest men in the system," he said. "I will call a lawyer I trust. We will find an inspector, someone who still believes paperwork matters more than bribes." The word "believes" was curious in a room where belief was a luxury. But belief could be a hinge. Vanessa nodded. She thought of a woman she had once met on a train, fatigued eyes, a phone number edged in graphite, that had become one of her quiet sources. She would need more of those. They did not rush. There was delicacy to the first moves. A wrong call, a known leak, could send Rana's men away with the 3 people Vanessa could least afford to lose. Informants she relied on. They set up a layered plan. Devender would use the family's legal channels to create pressure that looked routine on the surface. Arjun would appear to be consolidating the Malhotra ledger, ostensibly to tighten control after the shooting. Vanessa would continue gathering shards of proof and reach out to the few who owed her small favors. And they would bring a law enforcement partner into the quiet. Inspector Aruna Iyer, a woman who had earned Vanessa's respect years earlier by refusing to look the other way when a cost was asked of her. The first step was subtle and social. Arjun performed the act he knew best. He moved like butter in water, smoothing conversations, making small adjustments that would look helpful instead of intrusive. At staff briefings, he tightened security under the guise of caution. He reallocated cameras, not to catch a murderer, but to placate the family's nerves. It was the kind of theater that could protect a plan if staged right. Vanessa returned to her roots with an invisible purpose. Her hands, which had always folded napkins and cleared plates with a particular rhythm, now moved with an extra measure of scrutiny. She learned faces anew: the courier who brought spare batteries, the man who swept under the service stairs, the gardener who tended to the rear alley plants. Each person became a node in a network she had already half-assembled in her head. She started small. A photograph here, a casual question there, the way a maid can carry the world in the shape of folded sheets. Her collected scraps felt like prayer beads, each one worn to the point of memory. The informant, kept their notes short and urgent. Behind the logistics company flagged in the ledger was a nesting of accounts that moved money through decades-old trusts. There were warehouses on the outskirts of the city, registered under names that belonged to people who had long since been paid to forget. There were whispers that Rana had sown his influence into places that made people say he was untouchable. But whispers could be made into testimony with records, and records could be made to speak loud enough for a court to hear. Inspector Iyer arrived one humid dawn. She was not theatrical. Practical shoes, a short coat, a face that had learned to read the underside of statements. She listened without surprise. Around her, the ledger felt both flimsy and heavy, like a single thread that could pull at the hems of shirts across a ballroom. "We will need witnesses," she said. "Survivors who will testify, bank records we can subpoena, a chain of custody that won't break when someone tries to grease a palm." Vanessa was ready to hand over the names, but the inspector's next words made her hold back. "Chains are broken most often by the people inside who think they have something to gain. We go in gently but with teeth ready. We do not make displays. We make arrests that cannot be undone." Vanessa agreed. Teeth ready. Enough force to pull a man into a courtroom, not into a ditch. That phrase became a compass for her decisions in the days that followed. There was an internal betrayal that none of them saw coming at first. The man who balanced the Malhotra books, Shivendra Rao, a precise man whose face showed too few emotions, had the kind of access that made him the axis of any ledger. Vanessa had noticed his neatness months ago, the way he liked particular pens, and the way he smelled faintly of medicinal oils. She had thought him harmless. When she saw his name appear on a list of transfers, circled in a handwriting that matched the ones she had learned to trust, the knot in her stomach tightened. Shivendra's signature is on almost all the transactions that funnel through Rana's companies, she told Devender and Inspector Iyer, in a safe room lit without ostentation. He's the one who moves the money inside the company. Devender's face closed itself like a door. A man inside the house, he said. A traitor in our accounting. Arjun stood still for a long time. There was a pressure around his mouth Vanessa had not seen before. For a brief instant she wondered if he would protect Shivendra for the sake of continuity. Men like Arjun had the ability to rationalize the world in their favor. It was a skill that had taken him where he was. He made a choice in the way he spoke next. "Bring me what you have," he said, younger than his years and older at the same time. "I will handle the family review. I will not let this be brushed away." They moved carefully. Shivendra, when questioned, offered the practiced ignorance of a man who had been taught to forget the touch of dirty hands. He explained the transactions as routine. He insisted he had acted on orders, but there were discrepancies. A call that had been routed through a burner phone, a ledger entry with a margin note matching a name Vanessa had seen in a shipping manifest. The pieces met like teeth. It was not enough to take a man by his word. Evidence needed witnesses. It needed a timeline. Vanessa had the timeline. She had years of notes. She had the photograph from the courier, but she also needed the final, human element. The person who had been made invisible and who would be willing to be seen. Finding survivors was not a straightforward matter. They had been made small in systems that prized their silence. Vanessa traveled outside of the comfortable perimeter she normally inhabited. She went to a district where factories hummed and men sold breakfast to fast-moving workers. She worked slow and in low light, asking questions in the dialect that had opened the door in the hotel elevator. People who had never looked at her with more than a tray now saw a woman who carried proof. One woman, a former worker at a warehouse registered under a Rana shell company, met Vanessa in a market stall halfway between dusk and a downpour. Her name was Mira, and she had a scar like a faded river on her forearm. She did not want to talk at first. She had a child and a job she needed to keep. Survivors live with constraints that debtors and bosses understand. Speak, and the price may be your safety. Stay silent, and you live in two small rooms that poverty keeps wired. Vanessa did not press. She offered Mira a small envelope, cash enough to pay a month's rent, and the promise that she had paths that did not end in the dark. Words mattered. The right word said at the right time could open a mouth that had been sewn shut. Mira looked through the envelope, the ledger, the photograph. Her hands trembled, but her gaze steadied. "They used the trucks," Mira said finally, voice thin but steady. "They packed them at night. We were told it was relocation work. They gave us food, then locked the gates. I thought we would be taken to another job. I thought it was temporary." "Can you identify the men?" Vanessa asked. "Can you go to court?" Mira blinked and gave what could be given. "I saw Rana's emblem on a clipboard," she said. "I can say I saw it. It was small, but to a courtroom a small thing becomes a hinge that opens a door." Inspector Iyer moved with bureaucratic patience to turn small things into legal teeth. Subpoenas were written, bank accounts flagged, warrants were prepared that required proof but not celebrity. The raid would have to be made at precisely the moment when evidence was airtight. Otherwise, Rana's influence would find a way to leak the matter out of the newspapers. Vanessa spent nights sifting through camera angles, cross-referencing delivery times she had memorized against transportation logs. She called in favors from the men and women who had once protected her anonymity: drivers, night watchmen, a small-time accountant who loved tea, and slowly stitched a chain of testimony. She felt the old hunger for revenge simmer into something deeper, the need to prevent anyone else from being made invisible. The preparation had cost them time and danger. People noticed small things. Hands were watched. A phone went missing and turned up days later with messages erased. A courier's face, once helpful, disappeared into the city's tides. There were moments when Vanessa felt exposed the way an animal feels before a storm, skin sensitive, posture ready to flee. But each piece of evidence she accumulated made something else harder: escape for a man who had always relied on camouflage. The trap was set to look like routine business. Devinder's legal counsel initiated a purge of certain accounts under the pretense of an internal audit. Financial institutions fed a plausible reason, and the weight of the Malhotra name froze some funds pending investigation. Rana's people felt the pressure. They began to move like ants on a log. Vanessa's role was the last step. She would enter the space Rana thought of as his second skin, the club where he drank and decided, and carry with her a set of documents that would show the pattern of transactions, the names, the warehouses, and the bank accounts. She would carry witnesses and the presence of law enough to mean that when the doors closed, the place would not be a refuge, but a cage. She chose her outfit like she chose sheets. Folded, exact, unobtrusive. The club was a place of muted lights and louder appetites. Vanessa moved through the kitchen, a place she knew by touch and smell, slipping in as she had during service runs. The hum of the refrigeration units swallowed sounds. She wore the same economy of motion, the same invisible choreography. Under her apron she carried nothing that could be traced. She carried only what mattered, a resilience that had been trained into her bones. Inside the club, the music wrapped bodies in momentum. Rana sat like a small monarch on a raised platform. He was a man who made capital out of control. A coppery face, a laugh that sounded like clinking coins. He had not expected Vanessa. He had not expected Devender's paper to reach into his room. Vanessa worked the crowd, the same way she had worked hotel tables. She watched Rana and his lieutenants the way a surgeon watches a chest. When she first saw him close enough, her heart narrowed into a fine point. He did not look like the kind of man who would remember a face he had not known. He looked like a man who had grown used to surfaces, and thus failed to notice what moved underneath them. The moment came when she was near enough to serve a glass. There was a deliberate slowness to the movement, an economy of risk. A man from Inspector Ayer's team, plainclothes officers who had been planted as patrons, moved as well. They were a presence that mattered because it meant the building was both under observation and within a legal framework. Rana's laughter cut across the air when Vanessa placed the glass. He glanced up, and for the first time he allowed something like interest to flicker. "Who is this?" he asked no one in particular, curious about a server who seemed to carry herself differently. "Just staff," someone said, sounding bored. "New, from the logistics." Rana's gaze swept her in surface. He saw black hair, dark skin, a uniform. A filter passed between them. He had no idea what memory had already been sown inside her. Vanessa's face was a mask, practiced and plain. But inside, a coil tightened. She moved through the kitchen and kept her face neutral. Rana's men joked and spat words that tasted like trouble. But the presence of law and the simple weight of evidence made a subtle gravity that even they felt. The officers positioned quietly. Mira and other witnesses had been guided into safe spaces. Their presence in court could be arranged without exposing them to immediate danger. The net was closing. It did not close without fight. When the time came, one of Rana's lieutenants, an animal who had smelled pressure, attempted to break cover. There was a scuffle by the bar. Fists met something less than silence. The officers stepped in with the authority of paper and patrol. Rana's face tightened like a fist being closed. Vanessa watched. Her plan had not been to make a hero's stand. It had been to hand evidence to the state and let its teeth do their work. She had learned how to hate a man without losing her way. When Rana was finally brought into a side room to be questioned, she was there, a shadow in an apron in the doorway, carrying the ledger like a sacrament. Rana's face when he saw the documents was not the face of a man who had been surprised by circumstance, but of someone who had miscalculated the loyalty of people he thought bought. He barked, cursed, tried to bargain with the kind of smooth threats that have liquid in them, promise of worse things, offers of weight. It did not matter. The law was there, and its teeth were not easy to grease. "You think you can take me with paper?" he spat, as if language were a shelter. "I built empires on people like you." Vanessa did not speak. Her hands were steady. Inside her, there was a memory of Ravi's laugh and the child he had let call him father. She thought of the women and men who had been made into lists and spreadsheets, whose lives had been anonymized into a ledger line. She thought of the way justice could be procedural and yet sometimes enormous, how it could witness and thus change things. Inspector Ayer read him his rights with the procedural calm of someone who had seen the faces of both the powerful and the broken. Rana's threats became the sort of ferocious adjectives men use when they corner children. He tried one more thing, a sly suggestion that Arjun would prefer an unhelpful resolution. It was a thin attempt to bend family. Arjun, who had come because he knew the Malhotra name meant more than a mere ledger, watched from the hallway. His face was a kind of weather, Sudden thunder softened into rain. He did not move. The air had been tested in small ways across a life that taught him to swallow anger. Here, his stillness was a decision. Rana spent the night in custody. Arrests were messy and dignified in the most unlikely proportion. The media would later call it a sweep. The men who had cooked the trains of money called it an ambush. For Vanessa, it was a rotation of relief that felt like a muscle letting go. The weeks that followed were a different kind of battle. Courtrooms spun like slow machines that required patience rather than speed. Rana's legal team peeled back charges and tried to attack the credibility of witnesses. They hired men to dig into pasts, to find contradictions, to turn questions into mud. It was the predictable choreography of a man used to buying problems away. But the chain of evidence Vanessa had created was formal and precise. It was small things done over and over. Time-stamped invoices, copies of manifests, the ledger entries annotated in a crisp hand that showed transfers into accounts that had no legitimate business. Mira's testimony was harrowing in its restraint. She said what she had seen, nothing more. She talked about trucks and clips, about the sound of men calling orders, about the feeling of being counted as cargo. Her words, carefully delivered with the support of counsel and protection, pulled at the courtroom's seams. Shivendra, the accountant, was compelled by paperwork that could not be finessed. He folded like paper when presented with the paper of his own misdeeds. He gave names. He gave dates. The network that had once felt invisible now stood in light. The betrayal that had nested in the firm became visible. Its tendrils mapped into legal documents that described crime rather than bureaucracy. Rana tried to trade, to bargain with such paraphernalia as he had left. There were nights when Vanessa lay awake thinking of the choice she had been prepared to make when she had been younger. Revenge dressed as glory. In a dim kitchen, months before the arrests, she had bought a cheap blade and sharpened it without using it. A childish ritual that felt like the rehearsal of a life she had not wanted to lead. At the climactic hearing, Rana's eyes searched for vengeance in her face. He wanted to see the cruelty that would make him important in her narrative. Vanessa met his stare and felt nothing of the theatrical fury he expected. There was a quiet in her, a presence that had learned the difference between ending a life and ending a system. She had come to want something longer than blood. When the magistrate read the charges that would take Rana into months of detention, accounts frozen, trafficking networks dismantled, men indicted, Vanessa felt a small unshackling. It was not victory like a movie's fireworks. It was a legal process doing its slow work. Her pulse found its normal rhythm again. In the aftermath, the news made room for the human faces behind the case. Reporters found narratives, and the city told itself the story of a house that had sheltered a crime and a woman who had refused to stay quiet. Headlines were a shallow currency, but they bought space for survivors to tell their stories if they wished. The shelters that had been quietly used to house rescued people reported new arrivals. The language used in official statements was careful, respectful, and sometimes clumsy, but it had the power to change laws and budgets and public attention. Devender moved differently in the world after that. The man who had once collected people now had the look of someone who had learned that his stores of influence could be used for repair rather than purely for domination. He did not apologize. Apology was not the kind of currency he dealt in. He offered Vanessa something else, an opportunity to take the skills that had made her invisible and make them part of an institution that did not sell people for profit. In a quiet room lined with teacups, Devender proposed a new role. "We can offer you protection and resources," he said, "but more than that, a place inside the house, to run a small oversight of our logistics, to make sure no one within our system is exploited again." Vanessa considered it. The offer was generous and complicated. It placed her inside the very structure that had been both refuge and potential betrayal. She had learned she could not afford naivety, but she also knew what resources could do if not used to feed greed. She closed her eyes briefly and thought of Ravi's hands and Mira's gray forearm and the ledger on her table. "I will not be a figurehead," she said. "If I take the role, it will be to change what the house has been. I will create a unit that reports to people outside this family as well. Transparency, real oversight, with legal partners and protections for witnesses." Devender listened. A man used to being given the answer and finding it had to listen in a new way. He nodded, not with the command of the past, but with the patience of someone who had decided to be different. "You will have it," he said, and he meant it. There was a renunciation in Vanessa's voice when she spoke later to Arjun. He had been a complicated ally, sometimes brittle, sometimes humane. He had watched her move from a maid to an architect of exposure. "I don't want the family to be a ladder for men who will repeat this," she said. "If you want to be different, you'll have to be the kind of leader who makes sure the ledger shows faces, not numbers." Arjun swallowed, and for the first time in months, he said something that wasn't entirely defense. "I want to be better," he said. "But I don't know how to make the difference without making enemies." Vanessa thought of the way a person learns to move through rooms. "Start by making the ledger mean people again," she said. "Start by protecting witnesses and by making sure the legal system sees the evidence, not just the name. You can do that, or you can keep being part of what swallowed people." The work that followed was not glamorous. It involved meetings with attorneys who spoke in phrases that sounded like bones, paperwork that ate patience, and new protocols that made previously cozy nights of decision feel tedious. But there was also an odd, steady satisfaction in slow bureaucracy that saved lives. Vanessa set up confidential lines for reports, a check and balance system that required independent auditors, and a small fund for victims' support that would not be discretionary. She also trained people, not in violence, but in recognition, how to log a suspicious shipment, how to record witness statements without causing danger, how to hold the language of an explanation so that a court could understand a crime that had previously lived in the margins. She found gratification in teaching men and women who had once seen servants as something heir-like. They learned to observe and to value the small pieces of data that now built a different future. In the last scene of that year, the Marigold's lobby looked as it always had, gleaming, a public theater of wealth, but there was a small difference in the way Vanessa moved through it. She wore no uniform now when she walked past the front desk. Not often. When she did, patrons did not ignore her out of habit. A few looked up and considered the woman who had once been background. Staff members smiled at her in a way that suggested curiosity rather than assumption. She had not wanted gratitude. She had wanted a world in which the ledger read faces rather than numbers. Devender saw her one afternoon in the sunlight that pooled by the revolving doors. He sat with a cup of tea and asked for her company without imposing a weight. She came and took a chair. "You are different now," he said, watching the light flicker on her wrist where a faint scar interrupted the skin. "So are you," she replied. "We did not end everything. We simply shifted the way some things are done." He chuckled, a small sound that had lost none of its habit but had acquired a softness. "I thought I would be dead inside of my resolve," he said. "Instead, some things feel like they might be remade." She looked down at her hands and felt the old muscles that had learned to hide and reveal. "I am not sure I want the family in my life like an anchor," she said. "I want the work to mean something beyond this house." Devender nodded. "Then we'll build that something," he said, "together and with others." There was a moment of silence that had nothing to do with absence, but with the space people allow when they are deciding how to live next. Outside, a bell chimed, and a bellboy rolled a trolley. Mira, the woman who had testified, passed by on her way to a consultation at a center set up with funds Vanessa had helped allocate. She offered a shy wave. Vanessa returned it. Sometimes, late at night in her apartment, Vanessa would hum the lullaby Ravi had taught her. Sometimes she would hear it in the cladding of a drawer or in the beat of passing buses. The city had not changed entirely. It was still the city, noisy, indifferent, alive. But inside its arteries, some things were different. A ledger had become a name. A name had become a story. A story had become, slowly and with great care, a reform. The last line of the ledger file stood like a small beacon. People accounted for properly, witnesses protected, assets frozen or returned to victims when possible. It did not erase the cost. It did not bring back what had been lost. It did make future loss harder. Devender came to her once more with an offer that was neither apology nor command. "Would you," he began, fumbled, then found the right word, "lead this unit permanently?" Vanessa considered. The room they were in smelled of tea and lemon and old paper. She thought of all the nights she had spent folding herself into invisibility. She also thought of the first time she had said a word in Bhojpuri and watched a man stop as if a bell had rung inside his chest. "I will lead it," she said finally. "On my terms. Transparent oversight, independent counsel, and a line to the courts that doesn't go through family channels." Devender nodded as if a weight had been lifted. He offered her a hand, and she took it, like two people sealing a practical covenant. Months later, a photograph circulated quietly in certain circles. It showed Vanessa standing in a room of men who had once been untouchable, not above them but at a table with them, maps and ledgers spread out. She was not posed like a trophy. Her posture was work-ready, the way a person stands when they expect to be useful. In the end, the greeting that had stunned a patriarch in an elevator did not make the last word in her story. It had been the first move. The finality lay in the work that followed, the patient accumulation of proof, the careful protection of the vulnerable, the refusal to reduce justice to a single act of reprisal. Vanessa kept the lullaby for herself. She hummed it sometimes in the early mornings as she walked the corridors she now oversaw. Sometimes when the hotel was quiet and a new maid arrived nervous on her first day, Vanessa caught the phrase that started everything slipping from her lips almost like a test of reality. "Pranam, Dadaji," she would say quietly, not to call a past alive, but to mark the city where memory and care could meet. The city answered in small ways, through safer routes for workers, through ledgers that now bore witnesses' names, through survivors who had received compensation and counseling, and, most importantly, the right to be heard. It did not become whole overnight, but it did change, and that change kept the ledger from eating people without leaving a trace. If you appreciated the story of an invisible person who chose to make herself seen, subscribe for more character-driven tales where the overlooked become architects of justice.